Professor Richard Coleman believed he was about to prove that genius belonged to the prepared, the published, and the privileged few who had earned the right to stand before a chalkboard. He had no idea that within the next hour, a quiet woman standing near the back door would make an entire lecture hall question everything they thought they knew about brilliance. The late afternoon sun poured through the towering windows of Whitmore Hall at one of Boston's most prestigious universities, casting long beams of light across rows of polished wooden seats filled with graduate students, professors, and visiting academics from across the country. At the center of the stage stood a massive blackboard covered with symbols, proofs, and half-erased calculations that had slowly spread across the surface over the course of the last 50 minutes. Professor Coleman adjusted his glasses as he stared at the final expression remaining unsolved in the upper corner of the board. At 58, with silver hair and a reputation built over 3 decades of mathematical research, he was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. The silence hanging over the lecture hall only reinforced that belief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced confidently, setting down his chalk, "sometimes the value of a problem is not in solving it, but in recognizing why it cannot yet be solved." Several students nodded while others continued staring at their notes with expressions that moved somewhere between frustration and defeat. The equation had defeated everyone who had attempted it that afternoon. 2 doctoral candidates from Massachusetts Institute of Technology had failed. A visiting professor from Princeton had offered an approach that collapsed halfway through the proof. Even Professor Coleman himself had admitted that the currently accepted solution required nearly 3 pages of transformations that were impractical for live demonstration. A murmur moved through the audience as laptops closed and notebooks disappeared into backpacks. Near the back entrance of the lecture hall, Claire Bennett stood quietly beside the door, holding a folded umbrella and a small paper bag from a nearby coffee shop. At 34, with blonde shoulder-length hair, a cream sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable shoes, she looked less like an academic and more like someone waiting to pick up a family member after class. In fact, that was exactly what she was doing. Her niece had attended an after-school mathematics enrichment program held 2 floors above the lecture hall every Thursday afternoon. Claire had arrived early because Boston traffic had been lighter than expected. As she waited, the sound of the lecture drifting through the open doorway had caught her attention. Her eyes moved toward the equation still resting untouched on the board. For just a moment, her expression changed almost imperceptibly, the same look someone might give an old photograph or a familiar song they had not heard in years. Then she lowered her eyes and checked the time on her phone. Across the stage, Professor Coleman picked up his notes and smiled slightly at the audience. Perhaps some problems simply cannot be solved in this room. The room responded with polite laughter. Near the back door, Claire looked up once more at the equation on the board. And for the first time that afternoon, the impossible problem was no longer alone. The audience began gathering their belongings with the quiet disappointment that follows an unanswered question. Chairs shifted against polished wood floors as students zipped backpacks and professors exchanged the familiar expressions of people who were already preparing explanations for why the problem had resisted them. Professor Coleman organized his papers slowly, clearly enjoying the unspoken message left hanging over the room. Some equations were simply larger than the people attempting to solve them. Near the front row, a doctoral student named Ethan Miller stared at the board with visible frustration. At 27, Ethan had published papers, won fellowships, and built much of his identity around being one of the brightest young mathematicians in the department. The equation refusing to cooperate felt strangely personal. "There has to be something we missed," he muttered to the student beside him. "We tried everything." Professor Coleman overheard him and offered a patient smile. "Sometimes experience teaches us that elegance is impossible. Complexity exists for a reason." Several students nodded respectfully. Then a voice near the back of the lecture hall spoke almost quietly enough to disappear beneath the sound of closing laptops. Not always. The room did not fall silent immediately because at first almost nobody realized someone had spoken. Claire stood near the doorway exactly where she had been before, still holding the folded umbrella and paper coffee bag. Her eyes remained fixed on the equation. Professor Coleman looked toward her politely. "Excuse me." Claire seemed almost surprised to discover she had spoken aloud. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I was only thinking to myself." A few students turned in their seats to look at her. Up close, she appeared even less like someone who belonged in a graduate mathematics symposium. The cream sweater, the simple jeans, the practical shoes. She looked like a parent waiting after school rather than someone following advanced mathematical discussion. Professor Coleman smiled politely, though there was amusement hidden somewhere behind it. You believe the solution may be simpler? Claire hesitated. Perhaps not simpler exactly. She looked back toward the board. Just different. A few students exchanged amused glances. Ethan laughed softly. If there was a different approach, somebody in this room probably would have found it already. The comment earned scattered smiles throughout the audience. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable. You are probably right. She lowered her eyes toward the floor as though hoping the conversation would end there. Professor Coleman rested one hand against the podium and studied her with curiosity that was becoming entertainment. Mathematics has always welcomed fresh perspectives, he said lightly. Would you care to share yours? More laughter moved gently through the lecture hall. Not cruel laughter. The kind people use when everyone assumes they understand the joke. Claire shook her head immediately. Oh no, I should not. Why not? Ethan asked with a grin. At this point we are accepting miracles. The room laughed again. Claire held the coffee bag slightly tighter in her hands. I was only waiting for my niece upstairs. I do not want to interrupt your work. Professor Coleman smiled warmly toward the audience. On the contrary, sometimes the best moments in academia arrive unexpectedly. He gestured toward the stage and the untouched chalk resting beside the equation. Please, indulge our curiosity. For a moment Claire did not move. The lecture hall waited. Somewhere outside the tall windows, evening sunlight slipped lower across the Boston skyline. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she began walking toward the board while the sound of her footsteps echoed softly through a room that still believed it was watching a harmless joke unfold. Claire stopped beside the chalkboard and looked up at the equation that had dominated the room for nearly an hour. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. The lecture hall watched with the quiet anticipation reserved for moments everyone believes they already understand. Professor Coleman folded his arms comfortably while Ethan leaned back in his seat with the relaxed confidence of someone waiting for an inevitable ending. Claire studied the final expression carefully, her eyes moving across the symbols with a familiarity that somehow felt older than the room itself. Then she picked up the piece of chalk. The sound it made against the board was surprisingly loud in the silence. She did not begin where everyone else had started. Instead, she erased a small substitution near the center of the proof and rewrote it using a notation several students immediately failed to recognize. Ethan frowned. Professor Coleman straightened slightly. Claire paused for a moment and almost seemed embarrassed by the attention. I am sorry, she said quietly. This may not work at all. A few students smiled politely. The room still viewed her attempt as a courtesy rather than a possibility. Claire continued writing. Instead of expanding the expression outward as every previous approach had done, she folded it inward using a transformation that bypassed nearly half the existing proof. Ethan's smile faded first. One of the visiting professors leaned forward in his seat. Professor Coleman lowered his arms. The room became quieter. Claire wrote another line beneath the first, then another beneath that. The chalk moved steadily without hesitation, but never with arrogance. It looked less like solving and more like remembering. Professor Coleman stepped closer to the board. Interesting, he said almost to himself. Very interesting. Ethan looked toward him in surprise. That was not the tone of a professor watching a mistake unfold. That was the tone of a mathematician watching something unexpected appear in familiar territory. Claire reached the section where every previous attempt had failed. The room waited for the collapse everyone expected. Instead, she introduced a theorem so rarely used in modern coursework that several graduate students exchanged confused looks. One visiting professor quietly whispered the theorem's name beneath his breath as though recognizing an old friend from decades earlier. Claire continued writing. One line became another. The impossible section disappeared entirely. The 3-page proof Professor Coleman had referenced earlier was suddenly shrinking in front of their eyes. Ethan slowly sat forward in his chair. Professor Coleman adjusted his glasses and stepped closer to the board until he was standing only a few feet away from her work. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone now. In its place stood curiosity. Claire finished the final line and gently placed the chalk back onto the tray beneath the board. The lecture hall remained silent. She looked toward Professor Coleman with an almost apologetic smile. "I may have made a mistake somewhere near the middle," she said softly. Nobody laughed this time. Professor Coleman stared at the board without moving. His eyes traveled back through each line once, then again more slowly. Somewhere near the fourth transformation, he stopped breathing long enough for the room to notice. For the first time that afternoon, Professor Richard Coleman was no longer looking at a problem. He was looking at an answer. The silence stretched across Whitmore Hall with a weight that no equation had managed to create all afternoon. Professor Coleman remained standing in front of the board, his eyes moving slowly from line to line, as though searching for the mistake everyone expected to find, and somehow hoping not to find it at the same time. Ethan watched him carefully. "Professor," he finally asked. Coleman did not answer immediately. He stepped closer instead. His finger followed the transformation Claire had introduced near the center of the proof. Then he traced the shortcut she had created through the section that had stopped every previous attempt. He adjusted his glasses once more and read the sequence again from the beginning. The room remained completely still. Claire shifted her weight slightly and glanced toward the clock on the wall. "My niece finishes at 6, she said quietly. "I should probably go upstairs soon." No one responded. Their attention remained fixed on the board. One of the visiting professors stood from his seat and walked down toward the stage without saying a word. A second professor followed him moments later. Soon 3 respected mathematicians stood side by side reading the proof in silence. Ethan looked from one professor to another, searching their expressions for reassurance. Instead, he found confusion slowly giving way to admiration. Finally, Professor Coleman lowered his hand from the board. "There is no mistake," he said softly. The words seemed to travel through the lecture hall one seat at a time. Ethan blinked. "What?" Coleman looked back toward the board again. "There is no mistake." He turned toward Claire for the first time since she had begun writing. "You reduced a proof that normally requires 3 pages into 9 lines." The room remained silent. Claire looked genuinely surprised by his reaction. "I only avoided the expansion step." One of the visiting professors shook his head slowly. "No, you eliminated the need for the expansion step entirely." Another professor stepped closer to the board. "I have not seen anyone use that theorem this way in 20 years. Ethan stared at the equations in front of him as if they belonged to a different language now. The symbols had not changed. Somehow everything else had. Professor Coleman picked up the chalk Claire had returned to the tray and pointed toward the center of the proof. "This substitution here. Why did you choose it?" Claire looked at the board for a moment. "Because the equation becomes symmetrical if you stop treating the variables as competitors." Several students frowned in confusion. Claire smiled apologetically. "I know that sounds strange." Professor Coleman slowly shook his head. "No, it sounds elegant." The room went quiet again. Not the uncomfortable silence of failure that had filled the hall earlier. This was different. This was the silence that arrives when intelligence walks into a room so quietly that nobody notices until it has already changed everything inside it. Claire glanced once more toward the clock and picked up her umbrella from beside the stage. "If everything looks correct, I really should pick up my niece." She smiled politely toward the room. "Thank you for letting me interrupt." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then somewhere near the front row, a single pair of hands began to clap. The applause spread through Whitmore Hall slowly at first, as though the room needed permission to believe what it had just witnessed. One pair of hands became several. Several became dozens. Within seconds, the entire lecture hall had risen to its feet. Graduate students, visiting professors, researchers, and academics who had spent their lives measuring intelligence in publications, credentials, and conference invitations now stood together applauding a woman who had entered the room carrying a coffee bag and an umbrella. Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention. "That really is not necessary," she said softly. The applause continued anyway. Ethan remained standing near the front row, staring at the board as though expecting the proof to disappear if he looked away for too long. "How did you even see that substitution?" he asked. Claire considered the question for a moment. Sometimes difficult problems become easier when you stop asking how to force them apart and start asking how they fit together. Ethan blinked several times. The answer somehow felt more philosophical than mathematical and more mathematical than philosophical at the same time. Professor Coleman remained near the board with his eyes fixed on the 9 lines of chalk that had quietly rewritten the afternoon. I presented this problem in Chicago last year, he said. The proposed solution required nearly 3 pages and several assumptions that made practical application difficult. He turned back toward Claire. What you have done here changes that entirely. Claire looked almost embarrassed by the statement. I am sure someone else would have found it eventually. One of the visiting professors shook his head immediately. Perhaps eventually, but not today. Another professor stepped forward from the audience. Excuse me, he said carefully. Have we met before at a conference? Claire smiled politely. I do not attend many conferences. A university faculty position? He asked. Claire shook her head. No. Ethan frowned. Then where did you study? Claire hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. Mostly at libraries. A few students smiled uncertainly, unsure whether she was joking. Professor Coleman did not smile. His attention had moved from the proof to the woman standing beside it. He studied her face carefully, as though searching through decades of papers, journals, and conference proceedings hidden somewhere in his memory. Then his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He stepped closer. Claire Bennett, he repeated quietly. Your name sounds familiar. Claire shifted slightly and adjusted the strap of her handbag. It is a fairly common name. Coleman looked back toward the proof and then back toward her again. Suddenly, he walked to the front table where copies of recent mathematical journals had been left for guests attending the symposium. He picked up one issue, flipped through several pages, and stopped abruptly. The room watched in silence. His eyes moved from the printed page to Claire and then back again. See, Bennett, he said almost to himself. One of the visiting professors looked up immediately. Another froze halfway through closing his laptop. Ethan frowned in confusion. Professor Coleman slowly lowered the journal onto the table without taking his eyes off Claire. The Bennett transformed papers. The room went silent once more. This time, even the air itself seemed to stop moving. The reaction moved through the lecture hall in waves of disbelief. The Bennett transform was not simply another paper buried inside an academic journal. It was one of the most discussed mathematical breakthroughs of the previous decade, a method that had quietly influenced fields ranging from cryptography to fluid dynamics, while its mysterious author remained almost completely absent from conferences, interviews, and public appearances. Entire graduate seminars had been built around work signed only with the initial C. Bennett. Professor Coleman looked down at the journal still resting in his hands, and then back toward Claire as though his eyes refused to accept what his memory had already confirmed. The author declined every award ceremony, he said quietly, refused keynote invitations, turned down visiting professorships at Stanford, Princeton, and Cambridge. One of the visiting professors nodded immediately. There were rumors the author did not exist at all. Some people believed C. Bennett was a collaboration between multiple researchers. Claire offered an apologetic smile. That probably would have been more impressive. A nervous laugh escaped somewhere near the middle rows before disappearing into silence once more. Ethan stared at her with open disbelief. You wrote the Bennett transform papers? Claire hesitated before nodding slightly. Some of them. Ethan almost laughed at the understatement. Some of them. As if someone might casually contribute to modern mathematics the same way they might casually mention gardening as a weekend hobby. Professor Coleman slowly closed the journal and stepped closer. Why use initials? Claire looked toward the board where the 9 lines of chalk still rested beneath the afternoon sunlight. Because equations do not care who writes them. Nobody spoke. She continued quietly. When I was younger, I noticed people often spent more time discussing the person behind an idea than the idea itself. Initials seemed simpler. One of the visiting professors shook his head with admiration. You disappeared from academia for nearly 10 years. Claire nodded. My sister passed away 8 years ago. My niece needed someone more than universities needed another paper. The room became still in an entirely different way. Not surprised this time. Respect. Claire smiled gently. Children are much harder to impress than professors. A few people laughed softly. Even Professor Coleman smiled. Then footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, and a young girl appeared in the doorway holding a backpack nearly half her size. Aunt Claire, she called. Claire turned immediately. I am here, Lily. The girl hurried down the aisle and stopped suddenly as she noticed the entire lecture hall staring toward them. Did I interrupt something? Claire picked up her umbrella and coffee bag before smiling warmly at her niece. Not at all. Lily looked toward the enormous equation still covering the board. Did they solve it? Claire glanced toward Professor Coleman, who looked back at the 9 lines of chalk before answering for the first time that afternoon without certainty, ego, or authority standing between him and the truth. No, he said quietly. She did. The room went silent once again, but this time the silence belonged to humility rather than astonishment. Claire took Lily's hand gently and adjusted the strap of the little girl's backpack as though the last 10 minutes had been no more remarkable than wading through a rainstorm or missing a traffic light. The contrast somehow made the moment feel even larger. Around them stood professors who had spent entire careers chasing elegant solutions and publishing papers that moved mathematics forward one careful step at a time. Claire simply looked like an aunt making sure her niece was ready to go home for dinner. Lily looked up at the board once more. Was it a hard one? She asked. A quiet laugh moved through the lecture hall. Professor Coleman smiled. Very hard. Lily nodded seriously. Those are Aunt Claire's favorite kind. The room laughed again, though this time the laughter carried admiration rather than amusement. Claire looked slightly embarrassed. Lily, the little girl shrugged. You always say hard problems are just puzzles that have not made friends with us yet. Several professors exchanged glances. Ethan looked back toward the proof on the board, and suddenly the sentence made perfect sense. Professor Coleman folded his hands in front of him and studied Claire carefully. You could have corrected us much earlier. Claire considered the question for a moment. You were not wrong about the mathematics. Coleman shook his head slightly. No, about you. Claire's expression softened. Most people see what makes sense to them in the first few seconds. The room remained quiet. A woman waiting near the door with an umbrella and a coffee bag does not usually fit the image people have of a mathematician. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. Claire noticed immediately. There is nothing wrong with expectations, she said gently. The danger comes when we mistake expectations for facts. Professor Coleman looked back toward the audience that had once laughed at the idea of her approaching the board. I owe you an apology. Claire smiled kindly. You invited me to solve a problem. That was not an insult. Coleman hesitated before answering. No, but the reason I invited you may have been. The honesty in his voice settled over the room more heavily than embarrassment ever could have. Claire nodded once. Then perhaps we both learned something useful this afternoon. One of the visiting professors stepped forward holding the journal that had started the recognition only minutes earlier. Would you ever consider returning to research? Claire looked down at Lily beside her. The little girl was already leaning against her arm, tired from a long afternoon of classes and tutoring sessions. Claire smiled. Research never really leaves you. She glanced toward the proof still standing quietly on the board. Sometimes it simply learns to share space with more important things. Outside the tall windows of Whitmore Hall, evening had settled over Boston, and the city lights were beginning to appear one by one across the skyline. Inside the lecture hall, nobody seemed eager to leave. The equation remained exactly where it had been before Claire entered the room. The chalkboard had not changed. The symbols had not changed. Only the people looking at them had changed. And somewhere in the silence that followed, an entire room began reconsidering what genius was supposed to look like. Professor Coleman walked slowly back toward the chalkboard after Claire and Lily had reached the aisle. His eyes lingered on the 9 lines of mathematics as though he were afraid they might disappear if he looked away for too long. Around him, conversations had begun returning to the lecture hall in cautious whispers. Visiting professors leaned toward one another exchanging theories, while graduate students photographed the proof before someone erased it by accident. Ethan remained seated in the front row with his notebook open and untouched in his lap. For nearly 10 minutes, he had not written a single word. He was simply staring at the board. Finally, he stood and approached Claire near the exit. May I ask you something? Claire smiled politely. Of course. Ethan hesitated. How do you know when an impossible problem is actually possible? Claire looked toward the windows where the first city lights of Boston glowed against the evening sky. Usually I ask a different question first. Ethan frowned slightly. Which question? Claire adjusted Lily's backpack gently on her shoulder. I ask who decided it was impossible. The answer settled over him in silence. Nearby, one of the visiting professors laughed quietly to himself. That may be the most dangerous sentence a mathematician can hear. Claire smiled. It can also be the most useful. Professor Coleman joined them moments later holding the journal issue beneath his arm. The confidence that had opened the lecture earlier had not vanished entirely, but it had changed shape into something rarer and considerably more valuable. Humility. I spent 30 years teaching students to challenge assumptions, he said. Today I realized I may have stopped challenging some of my own. Claire shook her head gently. That happens to everyone eventually. Coleman looked toward the lecture hall around them. Do you know what surprised me most this afternoon? Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. The proof. He smiled. No. The fact that I spent an hour searching for complexity while you found simplicity. Claire considered that for a moment. Complexity often makes us feel safe. Simplicity asks us to trust ourselves more than our methods. Coleman nodded slowly as though filing the sentence away beside the equation itself. Behind them, several students had gathered around the board discussing the proof line by line. For the first time all afternoon, nobody was talking about credentials, institutions, or publications. They were talking only about ideas. Claire noticed and smiled quietly. Lily tugged gently at her sleeve. Are we still getting pizza? Claire laughed softly. That was always the most important theorem of the evening. The room laughed with her. As she reached the doors of Whitmore Hall, Professor Coleman called after her one final time. Dr. Bennett? Claire stopped and turned. He hesitated before speaking. Thank you for reminding us what mathematics looks like before pride gets involved. Claire held the door open and looked back toward the lecture hall one last time. Mathematics was never the thing that needed reminding. Then she disappeared into the Boston evening with her niece beside her, while behind them an entire room remained standing among equations that suddenly felt much smaller than the lesson they had just learned. 3 weeks later, Professor Coleman stood once again at the front of Whitmore Hall facing another room full of students and visiting academics. The same chalkboard stretched behind him. The same rows of polished wooden seats climbed toward the back of the lecture hall. Even the late afternoon sunlight entered through the windows at nearly the same angle as before. Yet something about the room had changed. Near the center of the board, written carefully in clean white chalk, was a simple sentence that had not appeared on any syllabus or research paper. Challenge assumptions before defending them. Several students glanced toward the words as they settled into their seats. Ethan noticed it first and smiled quietly to himself. Since that afternoon, he had stopped introducing himself as one of the brightest students in the department. Instead, he had started introducing himself simply as a student. Strangely, his mathematics had improved almost immediately afterward. Professor Coleman looked around the room before beginning the lecture. 3 weeks ago, he said, I learned an important lesson from someone who never intended to teach one. The room became quiet. Expertise is valuable. Experience is valuable. But neither gives us permission to decide in advance where intelligence is allowed to live. Several students looked toward the sentence on the board once more. Across Boston, Claire Bennett sat at a kitchen table helping Lily with homework while a pizza box rested open beside a stack of spelling worksheets and mathematics exercises. The evening sunlight filled the room as Lily frowned at a difficult fraction problem. I think this one is impossible, she announced dramatically. Claire smiled over the top of her coffee mug. Impossible is a very ambitious word for a fourth grader. Lily grinned. What if I become a mathematician? Claire leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. Then impossible becomes an invitation. Lily considered that very seriously before returning to her homework. On the bookshelf behind them sat several journals and awards that few visitors ever noticed and even fewer would have recognized. Claire had never hidden her work exactly. She had simply never believed it needed to enter the room before she did. Back at Whitmore Hall, students filed slowly out of the lecture hall as evening settled over Boston once more. Professor Coleman remained behind for a few moments, staring at the chalkboard in silence. He looked toward the seat near the back door where a woman with an umbrella and a coffee bag had stood only weeks earlier and smiled quietly to himself. Genius, he realized, rarely arrives wearing the costume we prepare for it. Sometimes it wears comfortable shoes. Sometimes it waits patiently near the exit. Sometimes it solves the problem and leaves before anyone finishes understanding what happened. Outside, the lights of Boston flickered on one building at a time as the city moved toward another ordinary evening. But inside one lecture hall, an extraordinary lesson remained written far more clearly than any equation. Intelligence does not announce itself. It simply waits for the world to stop talking long enough to recognize it. And that day, Whitmore Hall remembered what humility looks like.